In the middle of a hospital lobby, an old woman rose from her chair, looked a billionaire straight in the eye and said, "Hey son, I waited half my life for this hug." Daniel Wade stopped with one foot still in motion, the glass doors sighing shut behind him. The lobby smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee, and the polished floor threw soft reflections of passing shoes. He glanced up from his phone and saw her, small cardigan slipping off a bony shoulder, fingers tremoring just enough to make the light quiver on her wedding band. She was watching him with an attention so direct it felt like warmth. "I think you's mistaken me for," he began. She took a breath that lifted her ribs and steadied her voice. "It's sips alright. I know you's super busy, just give me this moment." People moved around them, a porter steering an empty wheelchair, a child dragging a stuffed rabbit by one ear, a nurse balancing a clipboard and a paper cup. No one was looking. The air carried the soft beep of a distant monitor and the constant whisper of the air vents. Daniel set his briefcase down. Habit made him check the time. The watch face scrolled into a calendar full of things that felt suddenly abstract. He wasn't a man given to unplanned contact. Handshakes, yes. Hugs, no. Yet there was a steadiness in her request that made refusal feel ungenerous. He stepped closer. Her arms rose with the cautious certainty of muscle memory. When she hugged him, it wasn't tight. It was careful, the way you might hold a letter you've kept in a drawer for years. He felt the shallow lift of her breath against his chest, the faint perfume of lavender and laundry soap. Her cheek rested against the lapel of his suit. "You came back," she murmured, not a question. He set his hands lightly on her shoulders, surprised by how slight she felt, surprised too by the tug, small and insistent, somewhere in his sternum. "I'm not your son," he said gently. She leaned back to see his face. Her eyes were a clear gray, more awake than he expected. "Maybe not," she said untroubled. "But you look enough like him to make my heart remember how." A nurse had noticed them, and approached with practiced softness. "Mrs. Calloway. They stir ready for you in imaging." To Daniel she added, "Lower, thank you. She's been waiting here all morning." The old woman patted his sleeve twice, the affectionate, absent-minded way a person confirms a thing is really there. "I kept thinking," she said, "if I sat where the light falls, he'd see me." She glanced down at the square of sunlight warming the toes of her shoes as if it had been a plan all along. "What's your name?" Daniel asked, and realized as he asked it that he wanted to know. "Evelyn," she said. "But most people use Mrs. Calloway here. It's easier to keep track." The faintest smile touched her mouth. "And you?" "Daniel." "Daniel," she repeated, tasting it. "That said'll do." The nurse offered her arm. Evelyn took it, then looked back. "Thank you for the hug," she said. "It's a good one. You must have had practice." He almost told her he hadn't. That practice required opportunities. That his mornings began with emails and ended with silence, and somewhere between he negotiated with people who measured care in numbers. Instead he said, "You're welcome," and meant it in a way that surprised him. They moved toward the corridor. Evelyn's shoes made a soft, deliberate sound against the floor. At the turn she raised her hand, small wave, small farewell, and disappeared into the bright hallway. The lobby resumed its neutral rhythm. The automatic doors opened, closed, opened. A vending machine rumbled to life. On the television mounted near the seating area, a muted talk show displayed a scrolling banner about mindfulness tips, a bright graphic unable to disguise the blandness of its advice. Daniel picked up his briefcase and stood where she'd stood, in the same square of light. Dust motes drifted lazily, floating up when the doors exhaled. He could have left. He was supposed to already be upstairs, offering congratulations to a partner's recovering father, but his feet didn't move. He pictured the old woman sitting here alone, adjusting and readjusting her cardigan, counting the people who weren't him. A volunteer offered him a foam cup of coffee. He took it, sipped, winced at the bitterness. The cup warmed his hands anyway. On the wall opposite, a corkboard held a scatter of notices, a blood drive flyer, a grief support schedule, a watercolor of a tree painted by a pediatric patient whose name was printed in earnest block letters. He read the schedule without seeing it. Mr. Wade, a young man in a slim tie, stood a polite distance away, breath slightly short from haste. "They stir ready for you upstairs." "Yes," Daniel said. and heard how flat the word was. He followed the man to the elevators, walked in, and watched the numbers rise. The metal doors reflected a tidy version of him, clean lines, practiced composure, a face that knew where it was going. The reflection did not show the echo of a sentence that had lodged just under his breastbone. Half my life. On the private floor he did what he was good at, shook hands, nodded in the right places, said the right things. The recovering father looked relieved to be noticed, the partner looked grateful to have his relief endorsed. Daniel signed a card someone had already purchased, and wrote a generic kindness in his precise hand. He left at the proper time. On his way out, his road curved him back through the lobby. The square of light had shifted, stretched thin by the afternoon. The chair where Evelyn had been sitting was empty. He paused, then told himself, this pause was nothing. A symbolic glitch in an efficient day, a sentimental flare that would dim like any other impulse. Outside, the city laid out its normalcy, taxis pulsing at the curb, a siren passing without urgency, air that tasted faintly of rain trapped in heat. His driver opened the rear door. Daniel placed the briefcase on the seat, but didn't get in. He looked back through the sliding glass doors to the chair against the wall. Empty chairs had never looked like anything to him before. He got in, finally. As the car merged into traffic, he opened his phone and scrolled through messages he'd already read, calendar blocks he already knew. The screen blurred when the car hit a patch of uneven asphalt. His thumb hovered, then stilled. "Home, sir?" the driver asked. Daniel watched the hospital shrink in the side mirror, a white shape edged with mirrored windows. "Office," he said, though he wasn't thinking about the office. He was thinking about an old woman timing her hope to the angle of the sun, and the simple, unguarded way she'd said his name like a kept promise. He leaned back, closed his eyes against the city's restless light, and carried the shape of that hug the way one carries a quiet, unlooked-for ache, new, persistent, and not entirely unwelcome. "Back so soon?" the receptionist asked, surprised, as if Daniel belonged to another kind of place. He didn't have an answer ready. 2 days earlier, he would have walked past without hearing the question. Today, he heard everything: the squeak of the floor buffer near the windows, the soft clack of a volunteer sorting magazines, the slow breath of the automatic doors as they opened and closed like a patient machine. The lobby smelled the same coffee that had been warming too long, and the clean, thin scent of disinfectant. "I'm meeting someone," he said, and only realized the strangeness of it after the words were out. He found the chair where she'd sat before, empty. A triangle of light lay across the vinyl seat, as if it had been saving her place. He stayed standing, scanning the room the way you scan a crowded terminal for a familiar face, certain you'll know it before you can name why. "Looking for Mrs. Calloway?" a nurse asked, pausing with a tablet at her hip. "Yes," he said, a little too quickly, "Evelyn. She steps in the garden room for fresh air." The nurse Sep's voice softened into something like approval. "Turn left at the mural." The mural was a field of painted wildflowers, the colors slightly faded from hands, brushing it as people made that same turn. The garden room beyond was a rectangle of glass and quiet. Potted herbs lined a ledge, mint, rosemary, basil, giving the air a green, almost kitchen-like smell. Outside the windows, a square of lawn held a pair of metal benches, and a tree not yet certain it was spring. Evelyn sat near the window, knitting in her lap, yarn pooled like a small cloud. She didn't look up when he reached the doorway. He stood there a second, taking in the careful way her fingers moved, the way the light found the silver in her hair. "You missed your bus," she said, still not looking up. Her tone was light, almost teasing. "I waited on the steps. Your father said the next one would come, but it didn't step. Or maybe it did, and I blinked." He pulled a chair out quietly and sat. "I'm sorry," he said, unsure if he was apologizing for that old day or for the ones he hadn't lived with her. She glanced sideways, then smiled in a way that made him feel seen and unnamed at once. "Well, you stir here now, that's the important part." "I brought mints," he said, placing a small packet on the table. "Lavender, like you mentioned." "Thoughtful," she said, weighing them in her palm, as if they had meaning beyond sugar. "You always did bring home some little thing. A bottle cap, a rock. You stead say, tea for you. Mom, sippa like you were paying me in treasures." He let the words settle. "Mom," it didn't sting the way he expected. It felt like standing under a word-shaped shelter. He studied her hands, thin, veins like threads under paper, guiding the needles in steady clicks. The rhythm was slow enough that he could feel time opening, not closing. "Tell me where you went," she said, eyes on the yarn. "All those years, tell me the story so my head can make it true." He could correct her now. It would be clean and quick, a knot slipped free. He could say, "Evelyn, I'm not your son." He could say, "I'm a stranger who looks like a boy you loved." But the words felt like shutting a door on a draft that had finally reached a stale room. "I worked," he said. "Too much. Different cities. Airplanes and meetings. Rooms with too much glass." "Did you eat properly?" The question came out automatically, and then she laughed at herself. "Listen to me. As if you said tell me the truth." "I ate," he said, and found it easy to add, "but not properly." "There it is," she said, satisfied. "You always sounded better when you were honest." They sat in a soft quiet. Outside, a maintenance worker watered the lawn with a hose that made a shushing noise, the stream arcing silver in the sunlight. The smell of damp earth pushed past the glass and seemed to clean the air. "What's your real name?" she asked, after a moment, as if they were measuring how much reality could be safely added without collapsing the form of what they had. "Daniel." She tried it out, nodding. "Daniel, strong, practical, fits your shoes." She lifted her gaze to his face, steady and open. "And what does Daniel do when he steps not here pretending to be my son?" He swallowed a small smile. "Mostly numbers, decisions, people who want things, people who want me to want what they want." "Ah," she returned her eyes to the yarn. "So you are busy for a living." That's Sep's one way to say it. She set the knitting down, smoothing the loose loop with a fingertip. "And yet you came back." "Busy people don't come back unless something tugged." He thought of the hug in the lobby, how it had felt like being briefly included in a ritual he didn't understand. He thought of the square of sunlight that she had chosen with such patient strategy. "Something tugged," he said. She nodded once, like a nurse checking a pulse. "Good." A volunteer came by with a cart of tea. The cups were thin and light, the steam smelled faintly of lemon. Evelyn held hers with both hands, warming her fingers. "You used to steal sips from my cup," she said. Made a face and did it again. "Sounds right," he said. "Do you have a mother?" she asked suddenly. And the question best's directness startled him, though it shouldn't best have, a real one, somewhere. "I do," he said, the words slow. "We haven't spoken in a long time." "Ah," she said again, but this time it held history. "That happens. You set something down for later, then later moves houses." She blew on her tea. "You should call her. Not because I said I'm telling you to, because your voice might be a good surprise for her day." He didn't promise. He didn't deflect. He took a sip and let the suggestion rest where it landed, simple and heavy. When it was time for her medication, a nurse appeared at the door. "Garden time steps up, Mrs. Calloway." "Evelyn," she corrected gently, then looked at Daniel. "You still be here when I come back." He checked his watch out of habit, and set it face down on the table. "Yes." "Then, I still be quick." She stood, gathering her yarn. As the nurse turned to guide her out, Evelyn added softly, "Thank you for using your real name." He watched her go, watched the slow, careful steps, the way she adjusted her cardigan at the shoulder without thinking. The garden room quieted again. Outside, the hose clicked off, and the sudden silence felt like a held breath released. He picked up his watch, and didn't put it on. He slid the packet of mints a few inches, so they sat square with the table's edge, through the glass. A few early leaves shivered on the tree, uncertain, readying themselves. When she returned, cheeks faintly pink from the walk, he was still there. She saw him and smiled like you smile at a familiar landmark after getting lost. Relief first, then calm. "Good," she said, sitting. "Now where were we?" "Missing the bus," he said. She reached for the yarn. "Then let's catch the next one," she said. And the needles began their patient conversation again, the small sound filling the room the way a heartbeat fills a quiet ear. "You're earlier today," Evelyn said, when Daniel stepped into the lobby. She was in her usual chair, cardigan buttoned unevenly, a crossword puzzle book opens on her lap. "I was in the neighborhood," he replied. It wasn't true. He'd rearranged a meeting and asked his driver to take the long way across the city just to be here. The crossword pen was resting in the valley of the book's spine. She tapped the page with one finger. 7 letters, T keeps you warm at night. He glanced at it. Blanket. Her eyes lifted to his face. Could be, or maybe love. The pause between them was small but noticeable, a soft thing settling in the air. Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead he sat, letting the lobby sounds fill the space, the shuffle of someone at the vending machine, the faint echo of a gurney's wheels against tile. They spoke for a while about small things, the weather, the nurse with the bright red shoes, the lemon tarts in the cafeteria she swore weren't as good as they used to be. She told him about the neighbor she once had who could fix anything but his own marriage, and about her son's habit of leaving the fridge door open while deciding on a snack. He'd stand there forever, like the right answer would appear if he just waited, she said, with a shake of her head. Daniel smiled faintly. Did it? Sometimes, she said, usually when I reminded him to close the door. A lull came and Evelyn Sepp's gaze wandered. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted, softer, slower. You never said goodbye that day. He looked at her. What day? The day you left. Her fingers traced the edge of the crossword page. I thought you stood be back for supper. I made meatloaf, extra ketchup. But you didn't said come, and then the days just kept going. Daniel's throat tightened. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that he wasn't that boy, that she'd mixed him into a memory he couldn't claim. But the look in her eyes made the truth feel like a cruelty. I'm sorry, he said, and meant it, though not in the way she thought. She studied him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. Can I have that hug again? The one I Sepp been missing. The first time in the lobby, he'd been uncertain, holding himself like a guest in someone else's ritual. This time he didn't hesitate. Daniel set his briefcase aside and leaned down, wrapping his arms around her. She felt impossibly light, like something the world had been careful not to bruise. Her hands rested on his back, and she breathed slowly evenly. The faint scent of lavender came again, threaded with the sharper note of hospital soap. It's such a good hug, she murmured. Feels like home. The words settled deep, touching something he hadn't named in years. He found himself holding her just a little longer, not because she asked, but because it felt wrong to let go too soon. When the nurse arrived to take her to her afternoon therapy, Evelyn looked up at him. Don't Sepp wait so long next time. I won't, he said, and was surprised at how easily the promise came out. She patted his arm once, the way someone seals a pact without pen or paper, and let the nurse guide her toward the corridor. Daniel stayed sitting for a moment, the empty chair beside him still carrying the warmth she'd left behind. Somewhere above them, a faint chime signaled the elevator's arrival, and a voice over the intercom called for a doctor in pediatrics. Life in the hospital went on at its measured pace, but he could feel that something small had shifted in his own. When he finally stood, the lobby felt different, not because it had changed, but because he had. The space where Evelyn had been seemed less like just a seat in a waiting room, and more like a place where something worth returning to had happened. And he already knew he would. That night, Daniel stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his apartment, the city sprawling beneath him in precise geometry, grids of streetlights, the slow pulse of traffic, the red blink of a crane far to the east. Normally, this view steadied him. It was proof of his reach, his control. But tonight, it felt like looking at something through glass in a museum, untouchable, meant for someone else. He had a drink in his hand, the cut crystal catching the dim glow from the kitchen. The ice clicked softly when he shifted his grip. He'd poured it out of habit, but the first sip had left a thin, bitter taste. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Evelyn in that chair, her small hand pressing lightly against his back, the way she'd said feels like home, as though she'd been saving the words for the right moment. He thought of his own mother, Maria Wade. The last time he'd been in her kitchen, he'd stood by the doorway, arms crossed, while she told him, again, that he was chasing the wrong things. That money wasn't worth the distance it built. He told her she didn't understand what it took to win. She'd said she didn't want to understand if winning meant losing each other. The argument had ended with his voice louder than hers. He'd left without touching the plate of food she'd set out for him, without even a goodbye. 14 years had passed. He told himself it had been easier that way, that their relationship had reached a point where silence was cleaner than the noise. But tonight, the memory wouldn't file neatly away. Daniel tried to focus on work. There was always work. He spread tomorrow's reports across the dining table, aligning the edges the way he liked, and sat down with a pen. But when he glanced at the first page, the words blurred into something else entirely, the crossword clue Evelyn had asked him about earlier in the day. 7 letters, keeps you warm at night. His pen tapped the paper. Blanket, love, both answers fit. 2 days later, during a strategy meeting, he found himself distracted again. A junior executive was outlining a proposal, and Daniel's gaze kept drifting to the window, watching the rain collect into rivulets on the glass. By the time the meeting ended, he'd already decided. He told his assistant he'd be out for the rest of the afternoon. The driver didn't ask where they were going, he just turned toward the familiar route. The hospital lobby was busier than usual. A man in a wheelchair waited near the reception desk. A woman carried a balloon that said "Get well soon." Daniel scanned the room, but Evelyn's chair was empty. A brief ripple of unease ran through him. "Looking for Mrs. Calloway?" a nurse asked when she passed by. "Yes. She steps upstairs for tests. Might be a little while." Daniel almost left. It would have been the logical thing to do. There were emails waiting, calls to make, deals to approve. Instead, he found himself wandering into the small gift shop tucked behind the reception desk. The shop smelled faintly of paper and chocolate. He picked up a crossword puzzle book, a smooth-barreled pen, and a packet of lavender mints. At the register, he added a folded greeting card, blank inside. He didn't know yet what he'd write. When Evelyn finally returned to the lobby, her steps were slow. The nurse beside her watchful. She spotted him before he could speak. "You waited," she said. "I had time." The words weren't true. He'd pushed 3 things off his schedule to be here, but they felt right. She eased into her chair, and he handed her the bag. "For you." Her smile was quiet but complete, the kind that began in the eyes and worked its way down. She took out the crossword book first, running her fingers over the cover as though checking the texture. "You remembered," she said. "I try," he replied. They didn't talk much after that. She opened the puzzle book, and he sat beside her, the rustle of pages mixing with the soft sounds of the lobby. Every so often she'd ask a clue, and he'd answer if he could. For the first time in a long while, Daniel noticed he wasn't thinking ahead to the next task, the next hour, the next move. He was just there. Daniel didn't bother with excuses this time. There was no half-true line about visiting a partner's relative, no effort to fold the trip neatly into his schedule. He just told his assistant to cancel the morning's first meeting and have the car ready. The drive to St. Mary's passed in a soft haze. He noticed the way early sunlight slid between the buildings, striping the sidewalks in gold, the way pedestrians wrapped their hands around coffee cups, like they were holding on to something more than heat. When he stepped into the hospital lobby, Evelyn was there. She had the crossword book he'd brought last time open in her lap, a pen balanced between her fingers. Her cardigan was buttoned wrong again, second and third buttons traded places, but she didn't seem to notice. "There you are," she said, the corners of her mouth lifting. "I was beginning to think you still missed the bus again." He smiled. "Not this time." He sat beside her, close enough to catch the faint scent of the lavender mints she kept in her pocket. "Do you know," she began, tapping the pen against the page, "that you've been in my dreams lately? Not you exactly. You stir taller there, and you still forget to take off your muddy shoes before coming into the kitchen." He let out a small breath of amusement. "Sounds like a bad habit. One I forgave 100 times, she said. He pictured the scene, imagined the mud, the cookies, the warmth, and wondered if that was what her son had really been like, or if she had folded him together from bits of memory and longing, until he became the shape she could live with. A nurse passed through the lobby, nodding politely to them both. Evelyn didn't take her eyes off the puzzle in her lap. "Tell me something about where you've been," she said. He hesitated, caught between truth and fiction. "Different cities," he said at last. "Meetings, buildings with too much glass, and not enough air." She made a soft hum, the sound of someone filing information away without judgment. "And did you find what you were looking for in those glass buildings?" "No," he admitted. "I thought I did for a while. Her pen stilled. That sip's the trouble with thinking. It makes you late for feeling. A volunteer came by with a tray of tea and small wrap biscuits. Evelyn took one cup and passed the other to Daniel without asking if he wanted it. They drank in companionable silence for a few minutes. The tea was lukewarm, but he didn't mind. When she finished her cup, she set it on the table beside her chair and leaned back, her gaze drifting to the windows. "You know," she said softly, "I used to sit there and watch the road for him, every afternoon. Sometimes I thought I saw him in the distance. I'd stand up ready to wave, and it would just be someone else." Daniel didn't ask if him meant her son. He knew it did. "What kept you waiting?" he asked. Her eyes stayed on the window. "Hope. It steps the easiest thing to carry, and the hardest to set down." They were still sitting there when a nurse came to remind Evelyn about her lunch. She looked at Daniel as if weighing something. "You still be here when I get back?" He checked his watch, then turned it over, so the face rested against his palm. Her smile held a quiet satisfaction, as if she'd just confirmed something she'd suspected. She rose slowly, the nurse steadying her arm, and let herself be guided toward the corridor. Daniel stayed in the chair, the crossword book resting on the empty seat beside him. Outside, the afternoon light had shifted, thinning into a softer hue. He found himself waiting without impatience, as though the act itself had become its own reason. The next time Daniel arrived, rain followed him in through the sliding doors. It clung to the shoulders of his coat, cold against the fabric, and left small droplets on the polished floor. The lobby was quieter than usual. No children clutching balloons, no chatter from the reception desk. Even the television in the corner was muted, showing a silent commercial for pain relief. Evelyn was as set in her usual seat. He scanned the room, feeling that small, unreasoning pinch in his chest again. Before he could ask at the desk, a nurse passed by with a clipboard. "She slept in the rec room this morning," the nurse said. "Said she wanted a change of scenery." The rec room was a warm space compared to the lobby. A handful of residents sat scattered in armchairs, a few flipping magazines, others watching a game show on the wall-mounted television. A faint smell of brewed tea lingered, and the low hum of a space heater filled the air. Evelyn was at a small table near the window, a ball of pale blue yarn in her lap and knitting needles moving in slow, deliberate rhythm. Her head tilted slightly toward the light, like a plant remembering the sun. "You found me," she said without looking up. "I did," he replied, taking the seat across from her. They talked about the weather, how the rain would feed the roots, and about the scarf she was making, which she claimed was for someone who doesn't know they need it yet. The needles clicked softly between them, a measured counterpoint to the chatter from the TV. When she stepped away to fetch more yarn from a nearby shelf, the nurse who had led him here approached. She lowered her voice. "She ever tells you about her son?" Daniel hesitated. "A little boy in the ride a posy hum on mountain the city foi settered of him the soul." The nurse nodded, glancing toward Evelyn. "He died almost 20 years ago. Car accident." She never really accepted it. Some days she talks about him like he seps still out there. Some days she seps certain he seps will come through the door. The words settled heavily in Daniel's mind, slotting into the spaces between their conversations. 20 years, a lifetime of holding open a door no one was going to walk through. When Evelyn returned, she eased back into her chair, setting the yarn in her lap. Daniel felt the truth catch in his throat. "Do I?" She nodded without looking at him. Same way of looking at things. Like you could see right through the mess to what matters. He could have told her then. Could have ended the pretense, explained that the resemblance was coincidence, and nothing more. But watching her there, content, anchored in a memory that was hers to keep, he found the impulse to correct her dissolve. Instead, he said, "I'm glad you think so." Her smile was small but certain. "I don't think so, Daniel. I know so." They sat together until the rain eased into a fine mist, the window blurring slightly from the warmth inside. She spoke about the time her son had learned to ride a bike, how he'd fallen and gotten back up 3 times before pedaling straight into her open arms. Daniel listened, the image so clear he could almost believe he'd been there. And in a way, sitting across from her now, it felt like maybe he was. It started without a plan. One Tuesday morning, between a meeting on overseas logistics and a lunch call with the finance team, Daniel found himself telling his driver, St. Mary Seps. By Friday, he was there again. Before long, his visits had their own quiet rhythm. Tuesdays and Fridays, sometimes an extra stop if a meeting ended early or he found himself passing through that part of town. No matter what was waiting in his inbox, no matter the market report on his desk, he made the time. He never arrived empty-handed. Some days it was a paper bag from the bakery across town, shortbread cookies dusted with sugar. Another time it was a mystery novel with creased pages and the faint scent of old paper. Once, on impulse, he brought a small potted violet, the soil still damp from watering. She'd placed it on the windowsill in her room like it was something rare. Evelyn received each gift with the same quiet pleasure, touching it lightly before setting it beside her, as if arranging pieces of a growing collection. Their conversations found an easy flow. She spoke about the years when her son was small, about the cat that would curl against his ankles, the way he'd come in from the cold with his cheeks pink and his hair damp from snow. She told him about the neighbor who always borrowed her garden tools and returned them, only when she went to ask. Sometimes her stories trailed off mid-sentence, her gaze drifting somewhere beyond the present. When that happened, Daniel simply waited. Eventually she would pick up again, as if there had been no pause at all. The hospital staff began to notice. He slept softer now, a nurse murmured to another as they watched him from the desk one afternoon. Not in a hurry the way he was before, he listens. They were right. Daniel felt it himself, in meetings. He found he was less impatient, more willing to let someone finish their thought. He started asking after his driver's family. He even caught himself looking forward to the quiet moments between obligations, instead of rushing to fill them. One Friday they sat side by side in the lobby with a small bag of peppermints between them. Evelyn took one, unwrapped it with care, and handed another to Daniel. "You've got strong hands," she said, glancing at his fingers. "Your father had hands like that, always fixing things." "What kind of things?" he asked. "Anything that broke," she said simply. "Chairs, fences, hearts." She gave a small smile, and for a moment Daniel had the strange feeling she wasn't talking about her husband at all. The afternoon sun shifted, catching in her silver hair. Around them, the lobby carried on a child's laughter from across the room, the low hum of the elevator, the scent of coffee drifting from the vending machine. It all felt oddly complete, as though this corner of the hospital had become a fixed point in his week. He left that day knowing he'd be back, not out of obligation, but because he wanted to be. The lobby was quiet that afternoon, the kind of stillness that seemed to muffle footsteps. The television in the corner played an old black and white film, the actors moving their mouths to lines no one could hear. A nurse behind the reception desk was sorting forms into neat stacks, her motions slow and deliberate. Daniel spotted Evelyn in her usual chair, the crossword book resting closed in her lap. She wasn't looking toward the door this time. Her hands were folded over the cover, her gaze fixed somewhere near her feet. He crossed the lobby expecting her face to brighten when she saw him. It didn't. "Brought you something," he said, holding out a paper bag with a lemon tart inside, the same kind she'd once mentioned liking before the recipe changed. Her eyes lifted to his face, sharper than he'd seen them before, clear in a way that startled him. "You star, not my son," she said. The words landed without hesitation, clean and unsoftened. Daniel sat down beside her, the paper bag still in his hands. "Evelyn," she shook her head gently. "It steps all right. I think I steps known for a while." Her voice carried no accusation, only a quiet acceptance. "I wanted it to be true. For a time I let myself believe it, but I can see it now." He didn't speak. The tart in the bag felt absurdly heavy, like something he shouldn't be holding in this moment. "You were kind to me," she went on. "You sat with me, you listened, you gave me back the feeling of being loved." Her fingers tightened slightly around the crossword book. "That's a rare thing." "I never meant to mislead you," he said. "You didn't stet." She gave a small, almost playful shrug. "I was the one who filled in the wrong clue. You just let me keep it there." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The film on the television changed scenes. A piano played faintly from its tiny speakers. Somewhere in the corridor beyond, a gurney squeaked as it was pushed along. Evelyn reached out, resting her hand lightly over his. "Maybe I needed you to be my son for a while. Maybe you needed to be one." He looked at her, wanting to respond but finding no words that seemed equal to the moment. She smiled faintly, as if she Sept heard what he couldn't say.
You.
Seb been good company, Daniel. That Sep's enough for me. When the nurse came to take her to her next appointment, Evelyn stood slowly, pausing to touch his arm. Don't stop coming, she said. I won stut, he replied. He watched her walk away, her steps measured, the nurse matching her pace. She didn't look back. Daniel stayed in the chair for a long while after she was gone, the lemon tart untouched beside him, thinking about how truth could land without breaking something and still change everything. That night, Daniel didn't go to the office after dinner. He sat in his apartment with the lights low, the city spread out in its usual glitter, and Evelyn Sipp's words looping through his head. Maybe I needed you to be my son for a while. Maybe you needed to be one. They were simple words, but they had shifted something in him, like a picture frame nudged just enough for you to notice it had been crooked all along. He thought about his own mother, Maria Wade. The last time they'd spoken face to face had been in the narrow kitchen of her house. The air had smelled faintly of garlic and simmering tomatoes. She'd told him she was proud of him, but then she'd said she missed the boy who used to sit at this very table and talk about his day. He'd brushed it off, said he didn't have time for that kind of nostalgia. They'd argued. It had ended with him walking out, leaving the plate she'd set for him untouched. 14 years had passed in that silence. The next morning he didn't schedule anything. He called a car and gave the driver an address he hadn't said aloud in over a decade. The suburbs looked the same, quiet streets lined with maples, the same postman making his rounds with a slow, steady pace. Her house was smaller than he remembered, paint peeling in places, but the rose bushes along the fence were full and in bloom, heavy with scent. He stood at the front step longer than necessary, then knocked. When the door opened, Maria was there, her hair streaked more with gray now, lines deeper around her eyes. She blinked at him once, then again, as if trying to decide whether or not she was imagining him. Daniel? Hi, Mom. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then she stepped back to let him in. They sat at the same old kitchen table, the wood worn smooth by years of meals and elbows. A kettle hissed softly on the stove. I wasn't sure you'd ever come back, she said, her voice low. I wasn't sure I could, he admitted. I told myself I didn't need to, but the truth is, I was wrong. She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes wet but steady. You hurt me, but I never stopped hoping you would walk through that door again. I'm sorry, he said, and the words felt both too small and exactly right, for choosing work over you, for not calling, for missing all these years. Maria reached across the table, her hand warm against his. I forgave you a long time ago. I was just waiting for you to forgive yourself. They talked for hours, about nothing and about everything. He told her pieces of the truth about Evelyn, enough for Maria to understand the strange gift of the connection they'd shared. She listened without interrupting, her thumb brushing over his knuckles, as if to say she was glad he'd found someone who'd shown him a part of himself he'd forgotten. When he left, the sun was setting, the roses casting long shadows across the path. Maria stood in the doorway watching him go, not with the look of someone afraid he'd disappear again, but with the quiet certainty that he'd be back. The call came early, before Daniel had finished his first coffee. It was a nurse from St. Mary's said. Her voice was gentle, the kind people use when they know the words will leave a mark. I thought you wanna know, she said. Evelyn passed away this morning, peacefully, in her sleep. Daniel didn't speak right away. His apartment was quiet, just the faint hum of the refrigerator, and the distant rush of traffic below. Thank you, he said finally. His voice sounded different to his own ears, smaller, less certain. The funeral was held in the hospital's small chapel. A handful of people gathered, a couple of nurses, a man from her old neighborhood, 2 women who said they'd known her from church. Daniel sat near the front, a single white lily in his hands. When the time came to speak, he didn't tell them she'd mistaken him for her son. That wasn't the story he wanted to leave behind for her. She was kind to me, he said simply. She reminded me what it means to be present. She gave me a gift I didn't know I needed, and I hope she knew I tried to give it back. That evening, instead of going back to his apartment, he drove to his mother's house. Maria greeted him at the door with an embrace that was longer, warmer than the one at their reunion. They ate dinner at the kitchen table, roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and a lemon tart Maria had made from scratch. Over dessert, Maria asked softly, "Was she important to you?" Daniel nodded. "Yes. In a way I didn't expect." "She must have been," Maria said. "You look different, like you've come home from somewhere far away." Later that night, back in his apartment, Daniel cleared a space on his desk. He set down a small silver frame with the only photo he had of Evelyn. A nurse had snapped it one afternoon in the garden room, both of them laughing at something neither could now remember. The city lights stretched out beyond the window, but for once he wasn't thinking about meetings, projections, or deadlines. He was thinking about a chair in a hospital lobby, a square of sunlight on the floor, and a hug that had started as a misunderstanding and ended as something much more. He touched the frame lightly with his fingertips. Home, he thought, doesn't always mean where you started. Sometimes it's where someone's kindness lets you arrive.